back, just hit that one, okay?
Okay. We're good to start? Okay. I think we are ready to start. Okay. So hello, everyone. My name is Hunter Smoke. Been building droids for probably close to like 3 years now. And today I'm going to be talking about my favorite part of the build, which is weathering the droids. Obviously closely related to painting droids. So the title you see up here, Give Your Droid a Story. That's kind of how I view weathering. And I'm going to talk about that to start. In the Star Wars universe, we see some pretty clean droids, but for the most part, droids and a lot of other stuff in Star Wars is very dirty. And that kind of tells you its backstory when you look at it. Like you look at R2 on Dagobah and he's all crusty with mud and you know that he's like been through a swamp. It gives you insight into where that particular droid or object or whatever, where it has been. So to start this, I'm going to talk a little bit about how things get dirty in the real world and how to think about that, because I think that's a really important way to approach weathering a prop piece, whether it be a costume or a droid or a prop or whatever. So there's a few different ways that stuff can get dirty in the real world. This list is by no means extensive. There is buildup from stuff like dirt or dust in like a dry form factor. There is a wet buildup like mud, like I was just mentioning with Dagobah R2. There's staining on surfaces. There is rust. There's paint chipping. And then there's more physical damage like dents and scratches or other stuff that physically mars the surface. So these next couple of slides here are all pictures of real world objects that I took pictures of. And we're going to kind of talk about what is going on in those pictures. And then we'll get into how you can translate what you see in the real world and get a similar effect on your droids. So I'll start pointing out here. We'll start in this corner. This is a porcelain doorknob that has seen a lot of use over the years. And you can see the paint has chipped off. One thing I do want to point out here in particular is the shape of the weathering and kind of the organic jagged shapes versus like kind of more round drippy shapes. This image right here, it's a really rusty side of an old metal box. And you can see that kind of erratic pattern that the rust has and the different color tones in there. Different color tones as far as like how things get dirty. That's something else to be aware of. Over here, we have more paint chipping, but also a lot of dirt buildup. That's the main reason I put this one in here. So you can see like along the edges of where the paint is chipped away, that tends to be an area where dirt will collect. And then over here, this is a good example of staining. So this is like a drainage port on a water collection barrel. And over the years, all the dirt in the water that's on here has basically stained that plastic surface. Weathering theory is a big thing. So I just talked about how objects get dirty, but you also need to kind of pay attention to where they get dirty. Your weathering on a piece should make sense in the context of how that particular bit of dirt or wear got there. So location is a big thing. That's not what I meant to do. So location is a big thing. The high points and the low points of a piece will end up with different types of wear over time. So high points are generally somewhere where there's going to be more scuffing. If something's being handled, those high points are what's going to bump into things or be touched first. So those areas get a lot of wear, and that's somewhere where paint will chip off or scratches will happen and stuff like that. Low points tend to be more protected. So the paint and stuff won't necessarily wear in low points, but you will get a lot of buildup in those low points. The base material is something to consider when you're weathering a piece too. Droids, obviously, like we assume a lot of those parts in Star Wars are metal, so they're going to corrode and get rusty. But there's also plastic components, and those aren't going to have rust. So if you're weathering something that you're going to assume is plastic, like stormtrooper armor or something, that's not necessarily going to have rust on it. The surrounding environment is important too. I keep coming back to Dagobah R2 because it's a very easy example. Dagobah R2 has a bunch of mud crusted on him because he's in a swamp. R2 on Tatooine does not show that at all. He's got sand built up instead of mud. So depending on like where you envision your droid coming from or what kind of story you want to tell, that's important to consider too. Additive and subtractive is another thing to keep in mind. So I mentioned like stuff rubbing on high points. That's obviously a way that things get worn. But on surfaces, stuff will get wiped off too when it's just handled or people are trying to clean it. You got to think about what areas are hard to clean versus not to clean. And then that kind of goes into thinking about grime building up either additive or subtractive. Opacity is something to think of as well. I put this image up here because you can see there's like this oxidation buildup on this panel. And there's certain areas where it's like full on white crusty oxidation. And then there's other areas where it's not fully corroded and you can still see like the blue underneath. So there's varying levels of transparency on the dirt or grime that builds up on a piece. This start of a quote by Yoda here, always two there are. That is something that I think is really, really important for weathering. Stuff does not get dirty in just one way. There's going to be dirt, there's going to be mud, it's going to be different colors and all that kind of stuff. So generally when you're weathering, you're not just going to put a wash on it and then be done. You'll do a wash and some dry brushing or some paint chipping and then a wash. It's not necessarily just one step because that helps give it some depth and dimension and show that it was kind of built up over time through different methods. Scale. This one isn't necessarily as relevant for droids because we're mostly building stuff that is 1-to-1 scale. But if you were to be weathering like a smaller scale model, you're not going to make a paint chip the same size as it would be on your car or something. It has to scale with the piece, and that will help it make more sense in the context of what you're trying to paint as well. And then texture is also very important. So you can see on like this rusty bumper here, dirt has really built up in the texture of the rust. And there's other pieces too, like even if it's not rust, but just some surface has a natural texture, that's going to be an area where a lot of dirt and stuff sticks. This slide is just a bunch more images that I'm going to talk about. So this example here, I think really shows what I was talking about. One, about highs and lows. You can see how there's a lot of buildup in these crevices. And then the larger flat spaces and the high points are the ones that stay cleaner because when someone sets something on top of this crate, slides it off, it's naturally going to rub off on those high points and clean that dirt off, but it's going to leave it in these crevices or this is like a plastic crate, so it kind of naturally has a bow in it. So the dirt stays in the middle where it's bowed down. This right here, this is a control panel from a scissor lift. And that you'll notice all the weathering is mostly concentrated around the buttons where people are touching this thing most. And that's where you're going to get the most wear because it comes in the most contact with other objects. This is a good example here of, I think, the shapes that you get with a wetter type of weathering. This is from like some solvent cleaning solution being splashed on this surface and dripping down. And that kind of shows what type of shapes a wetter type of weathering will make. Over here, we have some more paint chipping with some dirt buildup on there. This one down in this corner, this is the bottom of a fry pan. And I think that really illustrates how much the opacity of your weathering can make a piece pop. You can still see like the grain of the metal under there, similar like if you're weathering the dome on an astromech when it's bare aluminum. You're still going to be able to see that grain under a lot of the weathering if it's more transparent. This example here, this is a taillight on an Airstream trailer. And you can see that like these areas right here, flatter areas, there's not a ton of wear. But then right here and like on these edges, that's where stuff is going to rub more, come in contact with it, make a little chip in the paint, and then it kind of grows from there. And then over here, this is a more close-up shot of some paint chipping, and I think it shows the shapes really well and how erratic those can be. And now finally, we're getting to weathering in the context of Star Wars. So these are a few of my favorite examples in Star Wars, either in the movies or shows or the Disney parks. And they show a wide range of different types of weathering. I'll start with Boba Fett over here. That's my favorite example of weathering in all of Star Wars. And all of Boba's, or I should say the majority of his weathering, is done through building up layers of paint chipping and masking. And then he has some washes and other stuff on top like that. The Sand Trooper here is a good example of some dry weathering. Generally, like when people weather Sand Troopers, they're weathered with a product called Fuller's Earth. It's like a really fine dust that'll kind of stain the surface. And then with R2, I've already talked about Dagobah R2 and the mud buildup. You can see how it has a lot more texture, a lot more volume to what's stuck on R2. This R5 unit from Star Troopers, I think, is a really good example of a really like wet or oily weathering job on there. You can see how he kind of looks like he just had a bucket of really dirty water dumped on him or something like that. And then, of course, we have the Falcon, which kind of has dirt over every surface in there. But you still see variation like in these. It's kind of hard to see with the image being this small, but up in like these exposed panels, you get a lot different buildup than you do on these white panels here. So now we're going to talk about how you can actually dirty up a piece yourself. So I'm going to go through and talk about some different techniques. I have this little swatch booklet thing here, and this will go through. I'll pass it around. You guys can move it through. It has examples of, well, one, a plain unweathered, just blank primer piece. And then I've gone ahead and like isolated different types of weathering so you can see what those look like by themselves. A couple of them do have multiple things going on. And then on the back of each of them, I have a little label explaining what's happening. So washes are probably one of your most basic and common weathering methods. They can be acrylic washes or oil washes. Both types are just diluted paint. So acrylic washes are water or alcohol. Oils are with a different type of solvent. But really what you're doing here is taking a really like wet, watered down paint, painting on the piece so it can flow into all those crevices, kind of accelerating buildup over time. And then you wipe it back off to leave behind some weathering in those crevices, and then take off the dirt and grime from the high points when you wipe it off. So generally, I use washes for just overall surface dirtiness, as well as like you can concentrate it in areas and leave it sit for a little bit longer to help it mimic staining. And then it also really is good for buildup in recesses like panel lines on a droid. A thin liquid like a wash will really flow into those crevices, and then it'll stay behind there when you wipe it back off. Some general tips that I've found doing this. So I apply it with a brush. You can also apply it with a spray bottle, which is nice because it's a little more erratic and random. So that kind of ties into the other 2 points I have on here, that when you wipe it off or when you apply it, you want to make it less obvious that you applied it manually. So you don't want to leave brush strokes behind. So there's some different ways to do that. You can blot it off instead of wiping. I've noticed that kind of helps. It all depends on personal preference. And then you can also minimize the brush strokes afterwards by going back over it with a high grit sanding. I really like to use like a red Scotch-Brite pad. It's just abrasive enough that'll kind of pull some of that acrylic back off and knock down those brush strokes, but it won't necessarily actually like start to sand away your paint underneath. And then on each of these slides too, I'll have a picture of just kind of the generic materials that I use. I tend to prefer acrylic washes over oils. So that's what you see here. Acrylic paints, the Scotch-Brite pad, spray bottle, alcohol, or a brush to apply it. And here's some examples of acrylic washes applied. I mentioned using it to show buildup in corners. This is the cheek recess on a clone trooper helmet. And that was all done using washes to build up in those crevices. The longer you leave a wash, the more buildup it'll leave behind before you wipe it off. This is the top of an R5 dome here. And this has a more orange tone to some of the washes. And that can be used to mimic like a kind of a rust staining. And then this image over here is my Captain Rex armor. So that's a more zoomed out picture to show that washes kind of add up on the larger scale as well, and not just on a smaller close-up scale like the other two images up there. This, I don't know why the fourth video isn't showing up. Oh, there we go. Well, they don't appear to be playing, which is great, but I had videos in here of me weathering my droid right there. And I'll kind of point out what's going on in these. So like this looks like I just slapped some paint on there, right? But it's important to go back afterwards and wipe that off. So if the video was playing, it would show me applying all that paint on this pane right here, and then going back and wiping it off to leave it behind in the corners and stuff, but take it back off the larger flat surfaces and high points. And all of this kind of shows the different methods and how it can really like build up fast. Yep. On this one? So generally you want your base paint to be down first before you do the wash over top. The one, or any weathering over top. The one exception to that is like paint chipping. You kind of got to plan that out beforehand because that has to be done via masking when you spray on that top coat color. No, I think it's just glare in this photo. This is the same blue as this. It's just lighting angle, yeah.
So corollary to that, paint clear, then weather, or paint weather, then clear?
That is up for debate, and that's kind of personal preference, and it depends on your base paint as well. Sometimes I will do a clear if it's like a really precise, nicely laid out paint job, like on a clone trooper or something, when they have a really fancy stripe pattern. I don't want to mess that up if I'm sanding or weathering. So I'll clear coat that and then I'll weather. You don't always have to do it, but it can help protect what's underneath if you're going to be a little more aggressive with how you take weathering back off. But it's really up to you. And then I generally do always clear coat after my weathering to seal stuff back in, just because acrylic paints are a little less, they're a little more weak than like a spray paint base. Next, we're going to talk about dry brushing. This is another really common method for weathering models and props and stuff like that. So this is really just using really minimal paint on a brush to then apply it to the surface to mimic the look of really fine or imprecise scratches and scuffs and stuff like that. And generally, you see scuffs like this on like a big flat surface if something's going to bump into it and leave a black scuff or scratch behind or whatever color. And then you can also find a lot of this type of weathering on edges of things as well. So generally for some dry brushing, I tend to prefer stiff brushes because then you get like straighter, scratchy looking lines. And then another trick that I found too, and I'll talk about this in the next slide when we look at images as well. If you're doing more of a scuff instead of a straight line scratch, I will take the Scotch-Brite pads that I mentioned earlier and like tear them and just use the edge because it's already like a random thing that you can use to apply the paint. So it kind of takes out the human element of trying to make something random and uses something actually random. Generally for this too, less is more for dry brushing. It's really easy to kind of go to town and be like, oh, I want scratches here and scratches here and scratches here. But you should kind of use this more sparingly. and not necessarily evenly distributed. That's something I think I actually forgot to mention on the weathering theory slide as well. Weathering is not even over a whole surface. Like if you look at your an old rusty car, it's going to have a lot of rust down along the wheel wells and the bottom of the doors and stuff, but it's not going to be necessarily the same up near the top of the car. You kind of got to think about where things are going to actually wear the most. So looking at some examples of dry brushing, I'll start by talking about this image here in the center. So this whole edge right here, all of that white and gray kind of scuffing, chipping looking effect, that was done with dry brushing using brushes and a Scotch-Brite pad. So you just apply a little bit of paint on there. Sometimes I'll even like put the paint on there and then wipe it off on a paper towel to get even more of it off of what I'm applying it with. And then I'll go and actually add it to the piece and just do multiple passes until you build it up to the point that you're happy with. These other two, they're both images of a Bad Batch Hunter helmet that I painted. And those helmets for those characters specifically have a ton of texture in them. So really to get that hand painted look that these all have, I went in and I basically dry brushed the entire paint job instead of like masking off the different areas and then having to go back and like manually scuff it up. And then that also built up in layers too. So I had like a white and an off-white. And by layering those with dry brushing and some washes, you get a cool layered effect versus if you were to just stick to one color and one pass of dry brushing. The next thing I want to talk about is paint chipping. You had just asked about that, Todd. So the paint chipping is really the one method here that you got to plan out front before you actually apply your base coat. But paint chipping, it's exactly what it sounds like, but you're just manually controlling that. So you're using some masking agent that can be latex masking fluid. It can be painter's tape. It can be even toothpaste or mustard I've seen people use. Some type of substance that you can control to put on before you spray your paint layer down so that once that paint dries, you can wipe it off and then paint's not going to stick to that area you applied the masking agent. So you really want to use this when you're trying to expose underlying layers of something. Like if, again, I'm going to talk about clone troopers. I really like clones, so you guys are probably going to hear me talk about them a lot. But like a clone trooper that has a blue stripe down his arm, that was applied after the white paint. So sometimes you'll see paint chipping there on the blue to show the underlying white. Or sometimes on like a metal piece, obviously this droid's pretty clean, but other droids you'll see it where there is like masking done to have chips on the colored parts to expose the underlying metal. So applying this stuff, I'll just talk about what you got to use first. I tend to prefer to use masking fluids. So this is really just like extra thin latex. And you paint that on and it's easy to control where you want to put it. You put on with a paintbrush. I tend to prefer silicone paintbrushes because they don't get gunked up with the latex, which works really nice. That's what these are down here, those blue tip brushes. They're pretty cheap, about the same price as normal paintbrushes, but it saves you having to buy new paintbrushes every time in the long run. And then I have kind of mentioned you generally have to do this with a paint that you would spray to apply. So you could do it if you're airbrushing something or if you're spray painting something. Yeah, and then one last thing, I did talk about it when we were looking at some real world examples. The shape is important too. Because it's a liquid, when you put the masking fluid on, it's naturally going to want to glob up into a ball. But if you look at paint chipping on actual stuff, it's more jagged. So you kind of want to go in thinner passes so you can control that shape and make it a little bit more jagged so it looks more realistic. And here's some examples of that. There's this one right here, like I was talking about on a clone trooper. So this was applied on top of the white base, and then the red was sprayed on, and then that masking was peeled off to expose the underlying white to make it look like just that layer was chipped away. And same thing on these two as well. This is a Republic Commando helmet, and then a Boba Fett helmet that I've done here. all of that layered effect was done with latex masking. So painting out with the latex what you want to stay a certain color, spraying on the next one, and then repeating that until you get all your layers built up. These videos probably aren't going to play either, but I had examples here as well showing that process. This one, you really just apply that masking fluid, or if it was going to be toothpaste or something like that, you just apply it like you apply normal paint, and it dries pretty quickly, and then you can spray your paint over top. And then you just pick at it with your fingernail or an X-Acto blade or something to remove that masking fluid afterwards. And then now we're getting to kind of some of the more creative methods here. So scuffing and like physical damage, you can kind of do, I guess I should say the sky is kind of the limit for how you do this, and it really depends on your base material. So you're causing actual wear or damage on a part intentionally, whether that be with a file, like scraping something and scratching that paint, or even like scraping into the base material. You can like put dents in stuff. You can use a lighter and kind of scorch a piece. It all comes down to really judging the durability of your base material. This R5 dome here that I weathered up, I'm not gonna weather this the same way I weather a metal piece, because if I threw a drill bit at it, it could crack it, unlike a metal piece where it's actually just gonna chip the paint and the metal base is gonna be fine. Yeah, so a big thing here, get creative. Probably the most basic way to add more physical damage is files or low grit abrasives, because those are actually going to add scratches and they're easier to control than some other methods. And here's some examples of that here. These two close-up images are of some Jedi armor that I did. So this like blast mark here, I went in with a engraving bit on a Dremel and actually like ground out this blaster mark chunk that was removed. And then once that texture was there, I went over top of it with dry brushing and washes to make it look like it was metal that was exposed underneath instead of resin. This one right here in the middle, that's a Jedi shoulder bell. So this chunk that's missing right here, that I actually did just like cut that out, like a real shoulder bell would be worn if it got a chunk like knocked out of it by a lightsaber or something. And then went back again on the edges with dry brushing and stuff to accentuate that and make it look kind of scorched. This image right here is of my Mandalorian armor. So all the torso armor there is actual aluminum. And to weather that, I did kind of what you would do to remove paint from a real metal object. So I would spray it with a solvent to soften up the paint a little bit. I think I used a mix of acetone and high percentage alcohol, depending on how aggressive I wanted to be. And then I had a bunch of metal stuff, like I had a rasp, some old keychains, some old drill bits, and I literally just like threw it at the part, which was great because it made it easy to get a random pattern for that weathering. And then finally, I think this is one of the last slides I have in here. I'm going to talk about fake rust, which is part of the reason I have this dome right here. So rust has a couple components to it. There is a texture to it, as well as the color, which is like some more brown or just warmer earth tones in general. So when you're applying a rust effect to something, you kind of want to go about it and apply each of those characteristics of rust. I did show an example earlier where it was like just rust staining. So that's just that warm earth tone. But then you also have that texture component too. There's a lot of different ways to get a rust effect. My personal favorite is just taking acrylic paint and mixing in actual dirt or some other substance to give it texture, and then kind of caking that on. And then afterwards, I'll go back over with some washes of oranges and browns or some dry brushing of those same colors to really like bring out that texture that I just applied with the dirt and paint. So I mentioned over here, this again calls back to thinking about what the base material actually is. If your part would be plastic, you're not really going to have rust on it. So you would want to apply rust to a piece that would be assumed to be metal. So I mentioned I use like real dirt. We have like kind of more clayey dirt by my house. So I'll break it up into different size chunks, and that gives you some good variation in your texture as well. And then I did also mention too, overlaying that with washes and dry brushing to bring out that texture. And here's some examples of that. 2 of them are actually from this leg lamp here. And I'll talk about those first. So you can really see the texture in this one. And then the more translucent area around it, where the wash kind of feathers out around that. Sort of how like if something actually has rust and it gets wet, which causes that rust, it's still going to kind of seep out of that area onto the piece around the rust and stain that as well. This middle one here, less texture, but same principle. And then you can see how I kind of, in both of these, concentrated the rust in little corners where like water or something would actually build up to cause this oxidation. And then over here, this is really what I wanted to show in this image again. Just some warmer tone washes to really emphasize the staining versus the actual texture buildup. And we're going to talk about some additional stuff. Like I said, this PowerPoint is by no means extensive. And I did mention there's lots of different ways to apply rust, and I'm going to talk about this one first since we just talked about that. These dirty down sprays have been getting a lot of attention online recently. And those are they're kind of like pre-mixed washes is how I use them, pre-mixed alcohol washes. They're more stain-based than paint-based though. And they work great, and you can get some really neat textures and effects with that too. If the little swatch booklet thing has come around, you can see the one that I have in there that shows those sprays being used. And then they also have some other like paint-on paints with a brush that have more textured effects. Fuller's Earth, I talked about when I mentioned the Sand Trooper. So that is just a really fine dust that'll really work itself into any texture on a surface. Even if you don't think it has texture, chances are there's something that this fine dust will stick in. And that can kind of be used to get like a dusty buildup or like a stained effect. Downside with that, you generally have to seal that after so the dust doesn't rub off. Same thing with using real dirt. You generally, like if you smear real dirt on a surface or use it to build up in crevices, you're going to want to seal that afterwards with a clear coat so it's not going to rub off as your piece is out and about. If you're driving your droid at a con, you don't want a kid touching your droid to remove the weathering. Burn marks, I talked about a little bit on the physical weathering slide. You can hit a part with a blowtorch if you want. That is a very hard thing to control. And I've only had mediocre results with it at times. Sometimes it looks really good. Like if you happen to have a blaster you're weathering and it's real metal, sometimes you can get some really cool heat scorching on the barrel, but you got to kind of be very gentle with trying it to make sure it's not going to look weird. And then I'm going to talk about these two together, overspray and sanding and airbrushes. So both of those, like airbrushes and spray paint, are really good ways to get a color onto a piece, but weathering isn't going to be as like soft and feathered as an airbrush is when you apply it. So you're going to want to go back afterwards and scuff that back off. Again, I like to use Scotch-Brite pad or other high grit sanding materials to just take off as much as I can, but leave it in the crevices and make it look less soft than right when you apply it. And that's everything that I have. Feel free to ask questions. I have some pieces up here and back there that we can talk about as well. But yeah, Tim?
What's your favorite, probably more than one, clear coat? There's a clear coat that will keep things clear.
Yes.
And there's ones that will ruin your shot.
Yes. So clear coating for shiny objects is very different than clear coating for like this, that doesn't necessarily have as much metallic-y sheen to it. If you are clear coating an actual like silver or chrome surface, you're going to want to use like automotive grade chromes. 2K clears are really good for that. That's actually a catalyzed paint, so it's kind of like a two-part resin. And that will do less to harm your shiny silver surface underneath than other clear coats. The other ones that work really well, there's Aqua Gloss by All Clad. That's a good one that I've had success with, and I know other people like a lot. But yeah, and part of that does come down to what silver paint you're using as well. I think it's Duralumin is a common silver paint out there that people have been using. And even though 2K works really well with like Alumoluster, it as well with Duralumin. So it's kind of one of those things you got to research a little bit. But for general clear coats on just coating a painted surface, I really like Krylon's Flat Clear. It's easy to find. It's very agreeable. I find that Krylon is a pretty agreeable brand. Rust-Oleum I have more issues with. And then MTN 94 makes a really nice acrylic varnish that holds up pretty nice too. That's actually what's on this piece right now. And sometimes the acrylic varnishes too will behave better with shinier surfaces. Any other questions? Good.
So, speaking of Duralumin,
Yep.
with R7 back here, we use Duralumin. But you don't want to put the 2K auto clear on top of Duralumin
Yes.
because it will dull that on the finish. So the clear coat goes underneath.
Yes. So there are clears that can go over chromes as well, but it's pretty much always going to dull the surface a little bit. It's kind of like picking the lesser of the evils out there. And Duralumin is in the name. It's durable, more durable than other chrome paints that you would spray on top. So, go ahead.
Have you ever used acids for like dissolved metal?
I have not, mostly because I don't work with metals a ton. I have my Mandalorian armor that I did, and then some like a couple droid parts that have been metal. And I've never necessarily wanted that effect to actually, sometimes causing actual oxidation can introduce other inconsistencies or like structural integrity issues with a part that you might not necessarily want. I wish I did this for a living. No, this is just a hobby. Yep.
Right there on the right. So that actual texture, is that here you right? You said you have to do dirt.
Yeah, so I'll take acrylic paint and I will put some substance in there that is like something that'll give it some grit. A lot of like dirt is the easiest thing that I can find to do that. I've used sawdust before. I've actually used like dust from sanding. If I have a big clump of dust on the table, it's kind of helpful for whatever you put in there to be irregular and kind of a mix of other stuff, because then you get variation in the grit. Like if you're looking at this, you'll see some of these chunks are bigger than others. And that gives it a more uneven, natural look versus if it was all little chunks of the same size. Mm-hmm.
In the same image, in the joint, it looks like layer lines. And so I was wondering if there are things that you do to either like hide those sins, or like I imagine the particulates can help with that sort of thing.
So this particular piece, this was me trying to find something to do with a really crappy cast that I got from my first mold. So there are some layer lines left on this. I always recommend filling in your layer lines. I've had some people tell me that, oh, I'd leave layer lines on because I think it looks like machined metal. Personally, I do not agree with that at all. So in my opinion, you always want a pristine or as close to pristine as possible piece before you start weathering. So yes, there are still layer lines left on this. Good eye.
Yeah, it wasn't
No, yep.
I just imagine
Yeah. Yeah, a wash will actually accentuate those layer lines. And that is not to say that sometimes there are, so like I said, this is a really crappy cast. This is my first pull from a crappy mold that I made. And you can see like, where is it? There's like this dented area. I just decided not to correct that and used it as part of the weathering. You can make those choices, but you have to actually kind of like think about it a little bit more, you know? So,
Do the oil paints like actually dry, or do they still stay kind of?
it depends on the surface. That's part of the reason I don't like oil paints as much. I used to do more models or like custom action figures, and on more rubbery stuff, especially like PVC based plastics, it doesn't always agree with those and it'll stay sticky. And sometimes you can seal that and it'll be fine after, but I like to pick stuff that I'm going to use that I can trust is going to be more agreeable, kind of like I mentioned with the clear coat. So that's part of the reason I steer away from oils. Oils are sometimes nicer to get a more like drippy or actual oil looking effect though.
You ever tried the mopping glow? Like the mopping glow full wax?
Oh, as a clear for on top of chromes. I have not actually tried that, but I could see that working. That's a good idea. I imagine it's probably very similar to wash.
So he said
For those-
mop and glow?
Yeah, for those that didn't hear, he mentioned mop and glow, right? Or is it mop and go? Okay, it's like a floor wax, and he mentioned mixing in a paint to that, and then basically using that as your wash, which is not something I've tried, but I imagine it would probably work well. Any other questions? I think we're good. You know, I was trying to get Brian to let me do a live demonstration on